Good afternoon, everybody. My name is James Lin. I'm an assistant professor of Taiwan Studies here at the University of Washington. Welcome to our afternoon event, The Tiger Leading the Dragon, How Taiwan Propelled China's Economic Rise. This is an exciting new book talk that we have from Professor Shelley Rigger. I'd like to first introduce Professor Rigger. Shelley Rigger is the Brown Professor of Political Science at Davidson College. Her research studies the effects of cross-strait economic interactions on Taiwan people's perceptions of mainland China and on U.S. interest in Taiwan. We're very lucky to have such a senior scholar because Professor Rigger has really written kind of a number of landmark books on Taiwan, books that I use for my own teaching. So this includes her Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island Global Powerhouse, which is a fantastic introductory text. I assign it as required reading for my Taiwan history class, as well as her first book, Politics in Taiwan, Voting for Democracy and From Opposition to Power, Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party. And that was also just a watershed book in terms of understanding Taiwan's democratization. It's a book that I sometimes read with my graduate students. So today we'll be hearing about Professor Rigger's new book, as I mentioned, The Tiger Leading the Dragon. And I will let her take it without further ado.
All right. Well, thank you so much, James. It is a real pleasure to be here with you, kind of, in the way that we are with one another nowadays. And very excited to have the opportunity to introduce this new work, The Tiger Leading the Dragon, which took me a very long time to write and which I am gradually coming to realize it was a good thing. I'm pretty sure that the editor of this book does not think it's a good thing that it took me so long to write it, but I kind of think it isn't the worst thing in the world to have taken a long time, because it tells a story that when I started writing was still kind of in progress. We were kind of in the middle of finding out what it really meant for Taiwan to be helping to propel China's economic rise. But by the time I finished this book up, and it came out in June of 2021, so a few months before that, I think it was pretty clear that the arc of the story had peaked and that we can now safely conclude that the dragon has caught up with the tiger and is now kind of looking for ways to ease the tiger out of the picture. So where this project really began is with this contrast that we've all seen 1,000 times. Shanghai 1980, Shanghai 2006. And honestly, this particular section of Huaihai-Lu looks about the same in 2016 or 2020 as it did back in 2006. But just this massive, massive difference between 1980 and 2006. And how did China achieve this spectacular transformation in such a short period of time? This is one of the great questions of our time, truly. And so my little book is an attempt to put one possible theory or explanation into this very large and mysterious space. So another way to depict the same phenomenon that I just showed you in the images of Huaihai-Lu in Shanghai is this graph, which shows the PRC's exports. And where most of us focus our attention is on the dramatic increase in the velocity of the PRC's export growth after it joined the WTO in 2001. But I want to focus our attention on the first part of the graph. We all know that depending upon what's on the y-axis, the trend can be magnified or diminished. And if we change the y-axis to only cover the relevant numbers for 1978 to the year 2000, we see that actually there was quite a significant increase in China's exports earlier than its WTO accession. And I want to make the argument, in answer to this question, how did the PRC, a country with no private property or business, at the beginning of this graph in 1978, become the factory to the world by identifying a different kind of cut point or inflection point on this earlier graph? And that is 1987, because it was in 1987 that Taiwan first permitted travel to the People's Republic of China. And what you see is that there's also, while there was a very sharp increase in China's exports after 2001, there's also a pretty impressive increase in PRC exports after 1987. So the answer that I want to give to my question, how did the PRC manage to become the factory to the world when it had almost no business just a few decades ago? My answer is foreign direct investment. That it's really foreign direct investment enabled by policy, right? I'm not saying that PRC government policy didn't matter here, but what was that government policy doing that actually allowed export manufacturing to explode in the PRC? Well, a very important thing that PRC policy was doing was to not just enable or allow foreign direct investment, but to aggressively pursue it and to bring it in by all kinds of different measures and methods. And I further want to argue that the type of foreign direct investment that contributed the most to China's export manufacturing boom was manufacturing investment sponsored by ethnic Chinese from overseas, from outside of the PRC. And while many different ethnic Chinese investors played a role, Hong Kong investors are also important players in this trend. The most important group of manufacturing investors were Taiwanese investors, or the Taishang. And here they are. Such a big deal in the PRC that they actually made a TV series about them, telling the dramatic and exciting stories of Taiwanese who have come to the PRC to make business happen. These Taiwanese investors have transformed the PRC in many different ways. One is, and perhaps arguably the most important or consequential transformation that Taiwanese have brought to the PRC, is on the economic side. So, there's the Foxconn people making Foxconn thingies. That's almost too easy. But I also want to argue that Taiwanese transformed the PRC in other ways, not just its economy, but also aspects of culture and lifestyle that also are worth mentioning and thinking about. So I'm going to start with economics tonight, and then, or this afternoon, depending upon where you are. I'm on the East Coast, so it's evening for me. I'll start with the economics, but I do want to make sure to spend a little bit of time talking about how Taiwanese have changed culture and lifestyles within the PRC. So how did they do it? They did it by transferring Taiwan's own experience of export-oriented development to mainland China. So you will all remember the simultaneously hilarious and heartbreaking moment in Toy Story when Buzz Lightyear discovers that he is in fact not a real spaceman, but is, as all the other toys are telling him, a toy spaceman. How does he make this discovery? Well, he lifts this little flap on his gauntlet and reads the words "Made in Taiwan." I don't know. Probably a lot of the people on this call are too young to get the joke, but I'm not. When I was a kid, everything in the sort of Buzz Lightyear vein was made in Taiwan. Our Barbie dolls were made in Taiwan. Our little transistor radios were made in Taiwan. A lot of our little plastic doodads of various kinds all were made in Taiwan. So Taiwan first learned how to do export-oriented manufacturing itself and became the home of the Buzz Lightyear style product, and then exported that model to the mainland. So today, literally, Buzz Lightyear is made in China. So what I want to start with is just a really quick overview of how Taiwan became an export manufacturing powerhouse, and then I will um, help you understand a little bit about how Taiwan transferred that experience to the PRC. So Taiwan got its start in industrialization during the Japanese colonial era. So 1895 to 1945 was when Taiwan was under the Japanese Empire. And there was significant industrial development through most of that period. The Japanese imperial government or colonial government in Taiwan made a high priority of economic development, including human capital development, but also industrialization. So a lot of that industry was like the factory in the photo, um, agricultural processing industry, but it did have the effect of linking Taiwan logistically. So the Japanese built a lot of railroads, a lot of um, telegraph facilities, regular roads, all that kind of stuff that primed Taiwan for industrialization after the end of the colonial era. The second important phase in Taiwan's developmental path that I want to mention is the agricultural revolution in the 1950s that was possible because of the land to the tiller land reform program that the KMT government, so the government of the Republic of China under the nationalist or KMT party, instituted when they found themselves stuck in Taiwan after the end of the Chinese Civil War. So here we see what agriculture looked like early in the agricultural reform era. But what the agricultural revolution really did was to modernize Taiwanese agriculture by creating incentives for investment and productivity gains in the agricultural sector. So in the 1950s and into the 1960s, you saw a very rapid increase in agricultural output and productivity. And that produced two things that were critical to Taiwan's manufacturing development. One was capital, so farmers generating wealth and capital, and the other was labor, because as agriculture modernized and became more mechanized and efficient, agricultural workers were freed for other kinds of work. And that led into the explosion of small and medium-sized enterprises in the manufacturing sector in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The fact that it's SME-based manufacturing, so not big companies, but small family-oriented or family-based firms, is critical to understanding how Taiwan was able to become such an important player in global supply chains, even at a very early stage in its development, and how Taiwan was able to kind of compress what in many other countries has taken decades of time to develop into a really very short span of time. So in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that's when Taiwan becomes the home of the plastic doodad and the point of origin of much of the world's light consumer goods. Everything from umbrellas to shoes, apparel, toys, small electronics, and so on. However, this picture was beginning to darken in the 1980s because Taiwan's cost of manufacturing was increasing for a variety of reasons. Labor costs were going up, land costs were going up. There was started to be more of a demand for consumer and environmental and labor regulation. And also, Taiwan's exchange rates were not as favorable in the 80s as they had been in previous decades. So, a lot of Taiwanese SMEs by the mid 1980s were really starting to feel squeezed between their international customers who were buying the goods that they were producing and the cost of production in Taiwan. So it was extremely fortunate for those manufacturers that in 1987, Taiwan's president Jiang Jingguo decided to lift the prohibition on Taiwanese traveling to the mainland. The reason he did that was to enable elderly men who had been evacuated either as military personnel or as administrators of the ROC government, but had been forced to flee mainland China at the end of the Civil War. Many of them expecting fully to return to the mainland in some not very long span of time, but instead finding themselves stuck, if you will, in Taiwan for 40 years. And it was Jiang Jingguo's conviction that those men and some women as well should have an opportunity to return to the mainland to visit the families that they had left behind, to visit the graves of their ancestors before they died. So that was his stated reason for lifting the prohibition on travel to the mainland. So many of the people who went early in 1987, that sort of first wave of travelers to the mainland, were doing exactly what Jiang Jingguo had in mind. But many of them were accompanied by younger members of their families who were kind of doing something else, which is looking around. What is going on here in the PRC? And what they saw was an environment ripe for investment. This is the mid to late 80s. The PRC is doing whole hog reform and opening. There is a large workforce that is either un or underemployed, especially in rural and suburban areas of China. There are local officials who are falling over one another to recruit foreign investors to come in and make economic activity happen on their turf. And so these Taiwanese business people immediately turned around and went back, not with suitcases full of gifts for the family, but with suitcases full of investment opportunities for their contacts that they had met on the PRC side. So what very quickly happened was Taiwan's traditional manufacturing, all those toys, shoes, apparel, umbrellas, all that light manufacturing, small appliances, and so on, much of that industry moved in a very short span of time between 1987 and about 1992, moved to mainland China. And here's an example of such a facility. This is a Taiwanese-owned factory making swimming pool toys. A couple years earlier, it had been in rural Taiwan. Now it is, or in 1991, it was in a rural part of Shanghai. And the mode of production in the mainland was very similar, kind of indistinguishable from the mode of production back in Taiwan. Small, low investment kinds of facilities, just the basic stuff that you need in order to produce a simple manufactured good. Like they look like basketball hoops to play with in the swimming pool. Anyway, so what we saw in the years after 1987 was extremely rapid expansion of cross-strait investment and also cross-strait trade as all of those manufacturers needed to export components, equipment, all the stuff that they needed in order to do their manufacturing in the mainland. So here we can see some of the statistics on the volume of cross-strait trade and investment in those early decades. So then the question becomes, all right, if Taiwan's traditional manufacturing, upon which its an entire economy had been thriving for more than 20 years, if all of that decamped to mainland China, what happened to Taiwan? And I remember back in the early 90s attending many conferences. Maybe there's somebody on the call who remembers going to conferences where we just were beside ourselves with worry that Taiwan's economy was hollowing out and that there would be nothing left for Taiwan if the manufacturers continued to take their operations to the mainland. But that is, as you know, not what happened. Instead of hollowing out and disappearing, Taiwan's economy rejuvenated itself on a new kind of economic or industrial base, and that was high-tech industry. Part of the reason, a very substantial part of the reason for the success of Taiwan's high-tech and ICT manufacturing development was leadership from Taiwan's government. And this was true of the SME phase as well. We can talk about that more if you want to in the Q&A, but certainly during the 1990s and 2000s, Taiwan's government invested a lot in partnerships with private companies or incubating companies that could become private in the high-tech space. So what did all of these Taishang bring to or contribute to the PRC? Obviously money, right? That's the simplest, but many other things as well. They contributed jobs. A lot of employment in the PRC to this very day depends upon Taiwanese invested firms. They also introduced technology into the PRC, management expertise and kind of business know-how, and they introduced the PRC into supply chain relationships that I argue in my book would have been unavailable to Taiwanese to PRC manufacturers without the introduction from their Taiwanese partners. So I'm just going to run through each of these in a little bit more detail. Money, how much money? It's an excellent question, right? Taiwan government statistics tell us that official approved investment in the PRC totaled about almost $200 billion by the end of March 2020. However, we have good reason to believe that that is a significant underestimate of the actual amount of investment, partially because we know that some of the biggest investors in the PRC economy are definitely not generating that investment wealth internally. So we know that it is they are pass-throughs for Taiwanese, Hong Kong, and other money, including PRC money that's round-tripping via some of these third-party countries. So this PRC researcher, Guoqiang Long Guoqiang, has estimated, and I think that this is in the ballpark, but I am not committing to a number because I don't know, and I don't think any of us know. But he's suggesting 2 or 3 times that publicly acknowledged amount. So in on the order of 600 billion plus US dollars. That's how much money. Jobs are another major contribution of Taishan have made to the PRC economy. Um, as 2008 is a while ago, but as of 2008, Taiwanese firms were estimated to employ as many as 15 million PRC workers directly, not to mention people who are employed um, indirectly thanks to the Taiwanese firms' activity in China. And I think it's worth noting that while that may not seem like a very large number, it is Taiwanese manufacturing is not evenly distributed over the geography of the mainland. So there are places in the mainland where Taiwanese investors play a huge and decisive role in the local economy. So we've all heard of Dongguan in southern China, Kunshan outside of Shanghai, about an hour and a half west of Shanghai. But there are other places as well where, without the Taiwanese investors, it's hard to imagine the local economy taking anything close to the form that it currently does. Another big contribution that Taiwanese investors have made to the PRC economy is in the area of technology, with all kinds of new forms of technology, new equipment, new industries introduced to the PRC by Taiwanese firms. And very importantly, and I think often underappreciated, is the value of the managerial knowledge and kind of business process expertise that Taiwanese companies have brought to mainland China. This image is of the Castle in the Sky, a Studio Ghibli. This is from the Studio Ghibli fandom. I picked it because it reminds me of the characterization that my friends Yifeng Tao and Mingqi Chen, two sociologists who have worked a lot on Taishan issues the Taishan role in the PRC economy, and they came up with this metaphor of the fortress in the sky, that Taiwanese firms in the PRC are kind of fortresses in that the whole Taiwanese supply chain tends to move en masse to the mainland and set up its operation in a very self-contained way, bringing in PRC workers and using local contacts, especially local officials, to kind of run interference with the PRC state, but largely keeping their operations as self-contained as possible. So these fortresses kind of floating above the PRC economy, the sort of normal everyday economy in the mainland. Nonetheless, a lot of PRC people, a lot of PRC citizens work for and have worked for several decades for Taiwanese companies, and they have learned how to operate in these global supply chains, how to run a company that is capable of working for some of the global brands who previously would only work through their trusted suppliers, these Taiwanese contract manufacturers. So this is just a list of a few of the contract manufacturers from Taiwan and some of their important global clients. These are not companies that would have manufactured in the PRC if they were entering the PRC on their own. They manufacture in the PRC because they have Taiwanese contractors who can organize the production process and who can ensure that they will get the kind of quality, speed of delivery, and importantly, IPR protection that they need, even in a relatively new manufacturing environment. So, what did the Taiwanese get out of all of this, moving their operations to the PRC? They got a new lease on life. Many of the firms that are now huge and super successful in mainland China either didn't exist before 1987 or were on the verge of catastrophe in 1987 because of the cost of production, the rising cost of production in Taiwan. Taking their operation to the mainland allowed them to lower their costs, to reinvigorate their supply relationships with international brands, and to grow much larger than they could have grown in Taiwan with a much smaller workforce and just physical space for industrial development. So let me just conclude by talking about a few ways in which Taiwan and Taiwanese and Taishan have transformed China that go beyond how business is conducted. I'm going to talk about consumer taste, philanthropy, religion, popular culture. Also, PRC institutions have borrowed a lot from Taiwan and have relied a lot on Taiwanese consultants. So, consumer taste, the whole idea of affordable luxury, right? That PRC consumers could enjoy, and ordinary PRC consumers, right? Not the super rich who can indeed buy Gucci, Prada, wherever they go. But I'm thinking of now kind of ordinary PRC consumers in Chinese cities that are not super wealthy, but who would like to have that kind of international feeling of participating in the luxury or the beautiful, peaceful economy that they know is out there. So, for example, Starbucks. It used to be McDonald's, and still McDonald's in China, it's a popular brand, and people associate it with a nice experience. But Starbucks even more so. But Starbucks is too expensive for a lot of PRC consumers, and even with the adjustments that they make in their products, it's still it's not necessarily the taste that ordinary PRC consumers might enjoy. So a Taiwanese company, 85 degrees Celsius or 85度, came up with this sort of affordable version of the Starbucks experience that has been spectacularly successful in the PRC, selling that kind of sitting in the cafe, enjoying a cup of coffee, enjoying a pastry, but at an affordable price. So affordable luxury is something that Taiwanese have introduced into the PRC. Another introduction that Taiwanese have made in the PRC is philanthropy. The idea that civil society organizations would raise money and provide direct service to needy people within the PRC. And the leader in cross-strait philanthropy is, of course, the Tzu Chi Buddhist Compassion Relief Association, which was the first international NGO to be permitted to open an office and actually provide direct services in mainland China. Taiwan and Taiwanese people have also really contributed to the revival of religion in the PRC. Back in the 1980s, many of the early visitors to the mainland from Taiwan made their way very quickly to some of the most important religious sites, especially religious sites associated with the main traditional religious cult in Taiwan, which is the cult of the goddess Mazu. Mazu's birthplace and some of the most important Mazu temples, the sort of mother temples that have the most ling, they have the most sort of spiritual potency, are in Fujian. And a lot of Taiwanese went over to Fujian to visit those temples. And they donated a lot of money. They helped to revive those temples in terms of their sort of physical rebuilding, but they also taught people who were adherents of the Mazu cult how to do some of the rituals that had been lost or marginalized during the anti-religious fervor of the Cultural Revolution. So religion has also, in many ways, benefited in the PRC, this religious revival from the participation of Taiwanese believers. Also, of course, everybody knows pop culture, right? Taiwan has contributed a lot to the kind of soundscape in the PRC, as well as to the architectural cityscape. For the first Taiwanese entertainer to really break through in the PRC was Teresa Deng Lijun, who was beloved in the mainland, even when you really weren't supposed to be listening to Taiwanese music. They used to say back in the 80s, early 80s, that at night we listened to during the day, we listened to old Deng, Deng Xiaoping, and at night we listened to little Deng, Teresa Deng. But other Taiwanese entertainers have also made enormous inroads in the PRC market, including Zhang Huimei, Ame, now Amit Kulalai, who has a really interesting story of how she fell in and out of favor in the PRC, and of course, the unstoppable Jay Chou. Even language, even the Chinese language, as it is spoken in the PRC, has been influenced by Taishan. Influenced so much so that at one point the PRC government actually put out a directive saying that broadcasters in the mainland should not copy the Taiwan, Hong Kong accent or way of speaking. But my real favorite example of how Taiwanese have altered the language, the Chinese language, Mandarin language as it's spoken in the PRC, is this word tongzhi. Tongzhi means comrade, and it is the chosen translation of the Soviet idea of calling people comrade. In mainland China, under the Chinese Communist Party, tongzhi is the honorific, or I don't know if tongzhi is really honorific or not, but it's the word they use that means comrade. So in Hong Kong and Taiwan, that word got picked up by the LGBTQ community as a kind of ironic term for one another. And so in Taiwan now, tongzhi means gay. It also means gay in mainland China. So this is the Beijing LGBT Center website, and you can see that it is also the Beijing Tongzhi Zhongxin, so the Beijing Comrade Center. So this is a word that had a very particular meaning in mainland China that has been co-opted and transformed in a very playful and mischievous way, thanks to this kind of Taiwanese intervention. There's even one cultural phenomenon that I didn't know about when I wrote the book, but I have since discovered thanks to a blog post by my good friend Karim Friedman, an anthropologist in Taiwan. And that is the whole sort of contemporary Chinese tea ceremony, which is popular in tea-selling regions in the mainland, but is really adapted from the Taiwanese practice of gongfu cha or laoren cha, kind of a Taiwanese style tea ceremony, which is itself adapted from the Japanese tea ceremony as it was practiced during the Japanese colonial period. So there are just lots of ways in which Taiwan's participation in the PRC economy and everyday life has altered ways of living for mainland people. The next chapter for cross-strait economic and social relations is the chapter that I kind of alluded to at the beginning of decline. So, what many Taiwanese investors are noting is that they are no longer playing such an essential role in the PRC economy, and that instead the sort of Taiwanese or Taishang supply chain is giving way to what they call the red supply chain. That is a supply chain built out of indigenous PRC firms. So while I would not say that Taiwanese are no longer are leaving the PRC economy, I wouldn't say that. I think there is still a role for Taiwanese firms to play in the mainland, but it's not as critical a role and it's not as transformative a role as it was in those early decades.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Rigger. That was a really fantastic presentation. I look forward to the Q&A session. Let's see. We already have a couple questions coming in. Let's see. One is from Professor Melissa Brown. I love the book, and I've used it in a recent course. How much do you think that Taishang contributed to the PRC's growth earlier in the 1980s before there was official permission to travel?
Hello, Melissa. Thank you for being on the other side. I can't see you, but I wish I could. Yeah, great question. This is one of the most, I don't know, is it exciting? Is it frustrating? Is it infuriating? What is it? It's definitely a very notable feature of this work is that there are so many unanswerable questions. And part of the reason that I wrote the book the way I did, which is kind of not very scholarly, this is not an academic book at all. And that's partially because I prefer writing for a general audience, and I don't have to write the scholarly book at this stage in my career. But another reason that I kept the book a little bit lighter is that there's just an awful lot that I could not say with confidence. And the reason for that is that so much of this activity was and is to this day clandestine. So Melissa's question is a great question. How much were Taishang already doing in the PRC before 1987? Probably a fair amount. You could get in, or your money could get in to the mainland through Hong Kong even before 1987. There were ways for sure that Taiwanese business people were able to participate in the PRC economy even before it was legal to do so. And there are some who have said we started our business in the mainland in 1985 or 1984. So it's definitely real, but I definitely can't answer the question because all of that activity was illegal on pretty much both sides. So, people have tried to estimate it, but I don't think we really know.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. We actually have another question that's a little bit similar, so I'll ask that one next, which is, do we see a similar dynamic like the PRC-Taiwan relationship with Hong Kong, especially following the 1997 retrocession?
So I think, I'm not sure if this is asking, are Taiwanese investing in Hong Kong or are Hong Kongers investing in the mainland? I'm going to assume it's the latter. And the answer is yes. Like someone else can do that book on how Hong Kong contributed to the PRC's economic takeoff. I just it had taken already so long that I figured I better not add yet another huge question. The Hong Kong economy and the Taiwan economy are somewhat different, or were somewhat different in these early decades. So Hong Kong was there, definitely manufacturing was important to the Hong Kong economy. So somewhere around the time that I was growing up with made in Taiwan everywhere, we also saw made in Hong Kong. Um, but the volume of manufacturing investment that came from Taiwan was greater because Taiwan is a larger, just a larger economy, and less focused on banking, investment, trade, that sort of entrepot functions that Hong Kong was providing. So while it is definitely true that there was a lot of Hong Kong investment, especially right around Hong Kong, so out there in Guangdong, um, I think that the Taiwanese contribution was even larger and somewhat more diffuse geographically.
All right. Next question I'll ask is, can you offer any perspectives on the potential economic, I think this commenter means arc, potential economic arc of Taiwan, so its future and its push to join the CPTCC, the Trans-Pacific Partnership before China?
Yeah, Taiwan is always in some kind of economic crisis, right? We're never content. We never feel safe and secure about the Taiwanese economy, which I think is really interesting and probably should be true of any economy. Like whenever we're all economies are sharks, and as soon as they stop swimming, they're probably in trouble. But because the Taiwanese economy is small and the domestic economy does not have the kind of internal inertia to sustain a high standard of living on its own, which is not true of the US, right? The US is a really big one, and we sort of generate our own heat internally. But because Taiwan's economy is smaller and therefore sort of dependent on trade and engagement, external engagement, it always feels like at any minute, everything's going to come to a crashing halt. And that's part of why we were so worried about it in the early 1990s. Like, what if we're not making Buzz Lightyear and Barbie in Taiwan? What will happen? And what happened was TSMC, right? And would you rather be making Barbies or, the world's most advanced semiconductors? So, like, on the one hand, Taiwan is always pushing. What comes next? What's the next phase of our development? Why are we not there yet? How can we get there faster? Who's got a good idea? Where's the money going to come from? There's always a lot of agitation and anxiety. But so far, Taiwan has sort of caught that next wave in each sort of, as a wave recedes, they've found another way to get back to the beach. But something that is new in this decade, it's been happening for a while, but it seems to be maybe accelerating, is Taiwan's marginalization economically, right? Being kind of pushed to the side of global economic relationships and regional economic relationships so that it can't access the favorable trade conditions that others enjoy. And that is why that's why they wanted to get into TPP in the first round, and why they want to get into CPTPP as soon as possible. CPTPP is a consensus-based decision-making body. So if anybody says we don't want Taiwan, then Taiwan doesn't get in. And so if the PRC joins first, it will be only if the PRC decides that Taiwan should be in, that Taiwan would get in. And it's kind of hard to imagine how that could happen in a way that would be beneficial to Taiwan. The PRC can use its leverage with other CPTPP states to block Taiwan. So, it's not clear whether they'll get in even without the PRC being in first. But certainly, I think the logic in Taipei is if we're going to get in, we have to get in first.
Very helpful to know. There's another question from Professor Yingwei Ting. Can you talk a little bit about the Taishang's influence over time, especially after the PRC joined the WTO and FDI from other countries started to pour in?
Yeah, so that's certainly Taiwan's unique situation is not unique all the time. But there are sort of punctuated moments where Taiwan becomes especially important and kind of sinks its roots maybe more deeply, or Taishang sink their roots more deeply in the mainland than a lot of other investors or other nationalities were able to do. One of the most interesting turning points in this whole process was 1989, when the rest of the world, you will recall, sanctioned the PRC. And there was a real diminution in FDI from Western countries. And a lot of people thought, that the PRC's trajectory might be, they might never get back on track. And, but Taiwanese investors there was no sanction from Taiwan. There was no diminution in Taiwanese investment, particularly. In fact, many Taiwanese investors took advantage of the fact that everybody else is leaving to push in even harder. And the reason for that was that, this whole thing was happening outside of the Taiwanese government's control. So they got no help. The Taishan got no help from their government to go into China, but they also got no restrictions placed on them either. So what you see is Taiwanese, and actually I worked on a related project many years ago with a co-author, and my co-author was interviewing an official in mainland China about this exact topic. And that official said, I don't think we could have come back from 1989, the setbacks because of sanctions, because of the Tiananmen crisis in 1989, had it not been for the Taiwanese investors. Like, they saved us in 1989. Maybe he wouldn't say that today, maybe it's not really true, but I think it was a really scary moment for the PRC, and Taiwanese were right there to kind of fill in. So, that kind of gave them a bigger footprint than they might otherwise have had. And then another thing that has given Taishang a bigger footprint and sort of deeper roots, to mix the metaphor badly, than other nationalities is their ability and willingness to kind of integrate into the way things are done in Chinese local communities when it comes to business. So a lot of foreign investors have a foreign partner, they have a PRC partner. Most of the early investment was through joint ventures, and even after you could go in with a wholly owned foreign enterprise, a lot of the business advice that people were giving was, you don't want to go into mainland China unless you really know what you're doing. Get a partner, get a consultant, hire somebody, because Americans, Brits, Canadians, even Japanese will flounder in that environment. And one of the most popular consultants to get is the Taiwanese consultant who kind of knows how things work in mainland China and can navigate a lot of that stuff, but is not but he's on your side, right? So hiring a PRC person to be your representative is risky because you don't really know which team he's playing on. But hiring a Taiwanese, you can trust him because you know that he's basically on your team. So a lot of what I would just say in response to this very interesting question, that Taiwanese Taishan function differently in the mainland because of their facility with the way things work in, and I'm just going to go ahead and say it, like a culturally Chinese business context. So how do you make friends? How do you do dinner? How do you talk to public officials? How do you pay a bribe, maybe? These are things that Taishan got very good at. So I would say that even though there were many other foreign investors, they sort of played in a different stadium from a lot of Taishan.
Thank you, Shelley. Our next question is from UW professor Marie Anker-Doby. She is, in fact, teaching a course on Asian financial systems next quarter. So if there are any students who are viewing this, I'd encourage you to sign up for her course if you're interested more in finance. And hopefully we'll be assigning parts of your book, Professor Rigger. Her question is, can you talk about the future of Taiwan's economy now that China is catching up with it?
Yeah, so it's this catching the next wave thing, right? It's for Taiwan, the question has always been and continues to be, what is the next industrial or business opportunity that is going to allow us to continue to support like an OECD level economy. So Taiwan is not in the middle income trap, right? Taiwan is a high income country. But I guess you could fall back into the middle income trap if you couldn't find something new to do. And this is something that people in Taiwan are thinking a great deal about. What is the next industry? So semiconductor definitely working for Taiwan right now. It's not just TSMC. TSMC is the biggest and the best and the most everything. But Taiwan also has other semiconductor firms, and then it has a lot of other tech firms that are maybe a little bit, they're making other parts of our high-tech economy. Taiwan is looking at a lot of electric vehicles and doing things like, okay, so electric cars. Taiwan has never really had a super successful automotive industry, but they have had a lot of success in motorcycles and motor scooters. So I just read yesterday that, Taiwanese motorbike company, and I'm not going to be able to remember the name of it, even though I can see it. I can see the logo in my mind, is buying Harley Davidson's electric motorcycle division. So, like trying to think about where is our comparative advantage. Electric bicycles are a huge industry for Taiwan as well. And don't get me started on my most favorite electric motorcycle, which is Gogoro, which is a Taiwanese company that has like a genius solution to the problem of keeping your motorcycle charged up. But so, I think that's kind of how they will move forward, is kind of a combination of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial innovation, trying to lean into new industrial opportunities, and also strategic thinking on the part of the government. So ITRI, the research institute that I showed you the photo of earlier, ITRI still exists, and they're still thinking about, what is the next, um, what are people going to want to buy from us that we can make next? And that is all I can tell you. I don't know what it's going to be, but they're trying to figure it out over there in ITRI. And what I would say, since you're a finance professor, is there's tons of capital in Taiwan, right? Taiwan has probably the biggest economic problem, or one of the biggest economic problems facing Taiwan is um, uh, inflated asset prices, especially real estate. And that's because people have made a ton of money in manufacturing in the mainland, and they don't know what to do with it. So there's often people complain about the excess of human capital in Taiwan. Like, there are too many educated young people. They just want to sit around in coffee shops and have ideas. And they also complain about the excess of financial capital. There's too much money in this country and it's all invested in real estate and you can't afford to buy a place. To which I say, wow, what great problems to have, right? Put your idea having youth in the coffee shop and line them up with some venture capital and see what they can do. So, I'm not giving up on Taiwan's economy just yet, even though everybody I talk to in Taiwan is always super pessimistic, because that's just kind of the nature. I think that's how they manage to succeed, is by never resting.
Really good point. Thank you, Professor Rigger. I almost want to ask my own question, but there are so many more questions to go through. I'll save my question for the end. The next question we have is a very good one from Professor Evan Dawley, kind of a perceptive comment about this category of Taishang. So he's asking us to disaggregate this Taishang a bit. My assumption, perhaps incorrect, is that the younger generation that accompanied their parents on visits after 1987 were not part of the same segment of Taiwanese who went to renovate Mazu temples and teach Mazu worship. And I assume implied within Evan's comment is kind of a question that, the 1987, I guess people who are looking to reunify with family were predominantly Waishengren, and perhaps that you have Benshengren among the Taishang later on as well.
Yeah, for sure. Hello, Evan. Our shared teacher and I were talking about you just the other day. Yes, absolutely. It was probably a little bit complicated there, but the story, the way I told it, doesn't really adequately take account of the degree to which Taiwan's SME economy was dominated and is dominated by Benshengren, or native Taiwanese, who would not have been the people going for the humanitarian visits in 1987. That's for real. So what I would just observe is that it does not take long for the word to get around that there's opportunities. When people are desperately looking for a place to make an investment because they can't afford to stay where they are, they're not going to need much prodding to give this hot new thing a try. So I think a lot of the people who noticed the opportunity probably were Waishengren, but the trend of moving spread very quickly. But it is pretty interesting to look at kind of the sociology of who's in the mainland. And the Taishang are, as your question implies, a very diverse cross-section of Taiwanese society. So a lot of them are the traditional, what they call black hand bosses, guys who started a business literally making the thing by themselves. And then, they got their family to help them make the thing. And then they built a factory and they hired neighbors to help them make the thing. But they know what it's like to have your hands in the machine. And those are mostly native Taiwanese, or Benshengren. And then, but you also have some big companies that have gone to the PRC with much more professional management or sort of white collar management as well. And then you have also white collar workers. So there's like Taishang, and then there's Taisheng, Taiwanese students in the mainland, and there's Taigan, Taiwanese Ganbu, or like white collar workers. So it is a very diverse population. And a lot of the people who did the religious revivals were not investors at all, but just pilgrims, who went over to get to charge up their, the gods from their own home temples. So yes, you are suggesting something which is really true, which is that I have grossly understated the complexity and diversity of this population in my talk tonight. And I hope I did better in the book. You can tell me what you think, Evan, when you get a chance.
Thank you, Professor Rigger. Our next question is a really interesting one from author Amy Summers about Shanghainese. So she says that Chen Li's recent book in Shanghai's Middle Class argues Shanghainese played a big role in the PRC's post-78 modernization. Many Shanghainese business folks ended up in Taiwan post-1949, and so his and your arguments strike me as not inconsistent. Any thoughts on Shanghainese in Taiwan as a subset of the dynamic that you describe?
I'm going to have to say I don't know, because I've never actually met a Shanghainese from Taiwan in the mainland, and I have met a lot of Taiwanese in Shanghai. But that doesn't mean a damn thing because, there are a lot. So I just really don't know. But it kind of relates to Evan's point. The most successful mainlanders, so including the successful Shanghainese refugees, if you want to use that, if that's okay to say, went into government. So, the Waishengren mostly are not in business, but there are some. And there were some who, moved businesses to Taiwan. And I would imagine, I think it stands to reason that they would have looked for opportunities back in Shanghai, but I just don't know for sure. I didn't encounter anybody with that story.
All right. Let's see. Next question. From Professor Gao Yingchao. Given the current boom of China's political, economic, and military threat to Taiwan, do you think that it is exactly Taisang's successful in air quotes, successful assistance in PRC China's growth that has raised up the monstrous dragon and eventually produced the boomerang effect back to perhaps negatively affect the Taisang's own interest in the political economy and their autonomous lifestyle?
Yeah, probably. I guess the question is, what was the alternative? It seems like at the end of the story, it's not a happy ending, right? Taiwanese businesses are no longer afforded the kinds of privileges and advantages that they used to enjoy in the mainland. So it's getting harder for them to do business. Meanwhile, the PRC is using the wealth that's been generated out of all this export manufacturing to build the warplanes that it can fly into Taiwan's ADIZ. At the same time, though, this is still a really important economic relationship for both sides. And TSMC is still a huge supplier of high-end electronic components to PRC companies that are part of, that are core to the PRC economy. And if Taiwanese manufacturers had not gone to the PRC, that staying in Taiwan wasn't an option. at the time. So they did what they could, what they had to in order to stay in business. They, many cases, made a huge amount of money, which they have reinvested in um, growing businesses in the mainland, but also outside the mainland. And, I don't know how else this history could have gone better, except if the PRC government had followed a different trajectory. And that is beyond it turns out, any of our capacity to influence.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question to answer too, because I think that the perhaps counterfactual would really not have been possible to think about how entangled the global economy is. As you've said, that Taiwanese investors prior to 87 used intermediaries to accomplish their investment goals. And what could anyone have done about attempting to separate those capital flows? I think it would be kind of like trying to hold up maybe like a bucket to the ocean. It's not really going to do much. So a lot of this is really more about the global economy than it is about geopolitics. Um, there are a couple really great questions specifically about the book. So this is, you write in the book that economic development was especially urgent for Taipei, where the threat was not just economic, but went to the heart of the country's security. Could you expand on the security implications of these cross-strait developments? So kind of a similar question.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what. I think what I'm trying to say there is that the only thing that Taiwan has as a kind of that makes it important to the world is its economic contribution, right? There's so many ways in which, if Taiwan would just stop resisting, just like give in, let yourself be swallowed up, everything would be so much easier for everybody else. I mean, you hear this all the time. Charles Glazer, he published it in a magazine. Well, the US should just let Taiwan be absorbed. So how does Taiwan make itself important? How does Taiwan make itself needed? The solution to that problem has been primarily economics, by becoming an economic partner that everybody wants to engage with, that can then produce a kind of national wealth that allows Taiwan to buy a certain amount of protection, and also an international reputation that causes the PRC to think about what are the reputational costs of acting against Taiwan, right? So I think that's important. But then also, just because it's such a small economy, like I always think of Taiwan as like the Taiwan economy is like a hummingbird. It has to eat every couple of minutes. It's got to take in some sugar, or it just like dies and crash to the ground. The US economy is a dinosaur. It might already be dead, but it's so big and heavy and got so much momentum that it's still moving. And that's another reason why I think Taiwanese businesses and the Taiwanese government agonized over this in the early years. Like, should we let them go? But we can't not let them go, because if we don't let them go, then we won't get our sugar. And so there's just, in the survival of the economy, and with it the survival of the whole enterprise of Taiwan as a kind of freestanding entity in the world, depends upon keeping the economic wings beating hard and fast. So even when, it's not like nobody ever guessed that there would be negative consequences in the future to Taiwanese investing so heavily in mainland China. It was just that no one could see an alternative.
I like that metaphor. I'm going to have to use the hummingbird and the dinosaur for the next paper on Taiwan-US economic
Help yourself.
contributions. I'll give you credit for that one. Okay, next question. This is from Professor Steve Harrell. Given the continuing involvement of Taiwan capital in China, is all the current hype about military action just that? Media hype from PRC state media and US commercial media, just hype, something that's not going to happen.
All right, so, just got to name check Steve Harrell, who is, I don't even know if he knows this, but he played such a crucial role in my career. He gave me my first publication in a book that he edited. And back in the 90s, early 90s, when you went on the job market, most PhD, entry level PhDs did not have any publications, but I did, thanks to Steve. So I still appreciate that a lot. Yes. Okay. First of all, I think that there is a lot of hype. I mean, watch, the Chinese will drop a bomb tomorrow and I'll be proven wrong. It could happen. The stuff is all in place for catastrophe to occur. But I tend to be on the side with some of the other people I would consider kind of sober observers, and make the case that what is happening is the PRC is trying to deter Taiwan and the US from taking action that would further erode its position with respect to Taiwan. So I think this is wrong. I think this is a misunderstanding of the situation in Taiwan, but I do believe that many PRC policymakers and like Taiwan experts have convinced themselves that Tsai Ing-wen is just looking for an opportunity to bust a move. And that if she does, then Beijing is going to have to respond with military force, and they don't want to lose control of the timing. And, if they're going to invade Taiwan, they want to pick the time and manner that happens. They do not want to have to go to war unprepared. So they don't want Taiwan to do anything that's going to force their hand. And I really think they believe that Taiwan is moving in that direction, as nutty as that sounds to me. And more importantly, in some ways, they believe that the US is moving Taiwan in that direction, or that the US is increasingly now encouraging Taiwan and Taiwanese leaders to consider the possibility of changing from this very restrained sort of status quo approach to something more ambitious. So I think this is primarily deterrent. And it worries me a lot, honestly, to see American officials interpreting it as aggression, because the responses that the US is making to the stuff that the PRC is doing just reinforces the PRC's conviction that the US is encouraging Tsai Ing-wen to bust a move. And that's very scary. But your question, Steve, was about the continuing involvement of Taiwan capital in China. I think that the PRC would put all of that at risk in order to prevent Taiwan independence. I don't think there's any amount of money in the world that is too much money to spend to stop Taiwan from going independent. I also don't think that they are urgent to unify. And the fact that there's economic costs and sort of like business relations costs associated with trying to force that outcome probably does act as a bit of a restraint.
Thank you, Professor Rigger. That's a very sobering perspective. I appreciate that. Um, just to clarify as well, when you say kind of the doubts around or concerns around Taiwan's potential to bust a move, I think that you and perhaps most observers are somewhat skeptical of that portrayal of Tsai, right? I mean, she's fairly status quo with regards to what Beijing considers to be maybe threatening behavior.
Right, right. And it's not just Taiwan, although I don't know. It is Taiwan. It includes Taiwan. But if we go back even to, I think the last Taiwanese politician, like contender for the top office to say we should be independent, like we need a new flag, was Peng Min in 1996, presidential candidate of the DPP, who got clobbered. Peng Min did worse than the DPP candidates had done in legislative elections, and that was not supposed to be the dynamic. And so, and the DPP has been running away from a formal independence stance ever since. And nothing they do is ever enough to satisfy Beijing. But that's Beijing is operating on its own logic. They don't want to be satisfied on this point, I guess. So it's neither here nor there. But Chen Shui-bian campaigned as the guy who was going to like open direct flights and increase the amount of cross-strait trade and investment. He was Mr. Engagement as a presidential candidate. It was only after he was elected and the PRC refused to have anything to do with him that he began to talk about things in a little bit more adventuresome way. But even then, he wasn't talking about declaring independence. And then Ma Ying-jeou obviously, was not talking about declaring independence, but he was also, he was very explicit. We're not doing unification either. So, no Taiwanese leader has ever been satisfactory to the PRC, but nor has any Taiwanese leader. And remember, Peng Min, the guy who ran on the independence platform, did not get elected, nor has any Taiwanese leader ever actually come out for the outcome that Beijing fears the most.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay, let me move on to the next question. I'm curious as to the effects of the PRC on the culture of Taiwan and how interaction with the mainland has shaped modern issues.
That's a great question. Thank you. Here's the thing, not much, really not much, surprisingly little. And the reason is that until 2009-ish, it was a one-way street. People went from Taiwan, they went over to the mainland, they did their thing, they did their business, they went to work, they went to school. And, they came back occasionally. Some of them came back a lot, some of them came back a little. But people from the PRC were not coming to Taiwan. So Taiwanese influenced the mainland a lot. And I'm sure there are some, PRC, but you know what? There really aren't PRC television shows on TV in Taiwan. Taiwanese are like everybody else. They watch Korean TV. But now even Americans watch Korean TV, but Squid Game is too violent for me, so I haven't actually seen it. But anyway, when Ma Ying-jeou was elected in 2008, there were a very rapid series of agreements between the PRC and Taiwan that opened a lot of stuff. That's when we got direct flights, so you could get on a plane in Taipei and get off a plane in Shanghai without making a stop in Hong Kong first. Lots of stuff opened up. And one of the things that Ma did was to open Taiwan to tourists from the PRC. He also signed an agreement to allow a certain amount and very certain kinds of PRC investment in Taiwan. And what happened was, in about 4 or 5 years' time, the number of PRC visitors in Taiwan went from 0 to something like 4 million. So Taiwanese people had never really had PRC people in their orbit. And now suddenly PRC tourists are everywhere. And that freaked people out. And it was like all of a sudden, after all these years of viewing this as like no problem, because Taiwanese people go over there and they do their thing, and then, but it has nothing to do with me. Suddenly, it has everything to do with me. Like, I can't get to the grocery store because all of these tour buses are in the way. And Taiwanese suddenly realized, oh, China's real. It's real, and it's right there, and it's coming for us. And they're coming for us in their tour buses, but they're also coming for us financially. The investment, and suddenly just the magnitude of it, the potential for what could happen if 1.3 billion PRC people actually decided to get interested in Taiwan. And that's, I think, where this escalating series of protests in the early years of Ma's second term, so 2012, 13, 14, came from, and culminating in the sunflower movement. I think those protests were fundamentally about, oh, this is too big. This is too much engagement, because now they're here and we can't handle it.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Rigger. I also want to just drop mention for Ian Rowan's book, which will be coming out soon, about Chinese tourists in Taiwan. I look forward to reading that and hearing what he has to say, because I think it's a really interesting topic, and one that tells us a lot about.
Yeah, and sides. Another one of those things that's come back around full circle. No Chinese tourists in Taiwan right now.
Yeah, right. All right, we're almost at the end. I'm hoping we have 1 minute left. I'm hoping I could ask my own question. And this will hopefully tie together some threads that some people have been asking. I'm wondering about looking to the future. It seems like ever since the Trump trade war that many Taiwanese firms, notably Honghai, Foxconn, have sought to shift a lot of their manufacturing out of the mainland and into Southeast Asia, I guess continuing Chen Shui-bian's old southbound policy under Tsai Ing-wen's new southbound policy. Do you see Southeast Asia as being the new kind of China for Taiwan, or do you see that as not being able to completely substitute China in Taiwan's larger business environment?
Yeah, it can't completely substitute, in part because, Foxconn has developed a business model, just as an example, that rests on being able to put 300,000 people in the same building doing a job. And there's no other country in the world where you can get 300,000 people to go to work at the same place every day, So the sort of the magnitude of China and the way the workforce is distributed and structured there's like a path dependency there. So some companies, I think, they really couldn't do what they do anywhere else. But I think there are a lot of we know there are a lot of Taiwanese companies that are looking to get out of the PRC. It's getting more expensive to do, trying to figure out how to put count my numbers on my fingers in the picture. It's getting more expensive to do manufacturing in the PRC. There are fewer sort of benefits and privileges for Taiwanese and other foreign investors in the PRC. The political situation in the mainland is very unpleasant, and a lot of Taiwanese people don't want to spend time there. Um, the IPR situation is not improving. So a lot of companies that have, for whom IPR is important are looking for another place to go. So many have in the last year returned to Taiwan, sort of reshored some operations to Taiwan, although that, you're just sort of jumping back into the same small pool that you fled before. And some of the problems, expensive land, difficulties with certain kinds of labor are still there. And then a lot of other companies are looking, where else can we go? So Vietnam has been a huge beneficiary in traditional manufacturing of the rising costs in the PRC. But there are also companies that are looking farther afield even than Vietnam.
All right. Thank you, Professor Rigger. Any last words before we end?
Just thank you so much, and thanks to all the audience. It's really lovely to hear, so many people that I know or people that I wish I knew asking these questions and being on this call. So I'm really grateful.
And
And
thank you
please
so
buy
much,
the book.
Professor Rigger. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a fantastic discussion. Look forward to reading your book. I encourage everyone else to purchase Professor Rigger's book and read it. Her previous books have been just really fantastic, so I expect the same from this one. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.